Hello everyone. In this particular video, we will be discussing about hypothesis testing. I will try to explain this topic in a very simple way so that you don't face any difficulty in understanding it. Before starting with hypothesis testing, we need to know what hypothesis means. So, a hypothesis is an assumption or an idea that is proposed for the sake of an argument so that it can be tested to see if it is true or not. So, in hypothesis testing, we test any hypothesis, or what we do is we evaluate two mutually exclusive statements on a population using sample data. To understand this better, let us broadly divide the hypothesis testing into different steps. So, in the first step, what we do is we define the problem. Now, let's consider an example. Suppose I need to find in a court of law a person is guilty or not. So my problem will be to find the person is guilty or not. So this is my problem. The next thing that I need to do is to make an initial assumption or a hypothesis. I call this initial assumption as H0 or null hypothesis. So in this case, I take my null hypothesis or H0 as the person is not guilty. So this is my null hypothesis. The statement contradicting this can be that the person is guilty. I call this statement as an alternate hypothesis or H1. So now I have two mutually exclusive statements, that is the null hypothesis and the alternate hypothesis. Now, as we all know, in a real scenario, what happens is when a convict is brought to the court asks for evidences to prove that person guilty. So the same thing we will do here. We have our initial assumption. The next thing that we will be doing is to collect enough data or evidences to prove my initial assumption wrong. So in this case, I will be collecting data and evidences to prove the person guilty. If I get enough evidences to prove my initial assumption, that is the null hypothesis, wrong, I will reject my null hypothesis and accept the alternate hypothesis. Now, after we have the evidences, we need to make a decision. We have to decide whether I have to reject the null hypothesis or I have to accept it. Now, if I have enough evidences to prove that my null hypothesis is wrong, that is, in this case, I have enough evidences to prove the person to be guilty. What I will do is I will reject the null hypothesis and I will accept the statement opposite to it. That is, I will accept the alternate hypothesis which says that the person is guilty. But if I'm not able to find enough evidences to reject the null hypothesis, I will be left with no choice but to accept the null hypothesis. That is, I will have to consider that the person is not guilty. So that is what we do in hypothesis testing. Now, while doing the hypothesis testing, there could be cases where we make wrong decisions. So the different types of errors that we can have in hypothesis testing are type 1 error and type 2 error. To understand this better, let us consider the same example. That is, I define my null hypothesis as the person is not guilty, whereas I define the alternate hypothesis as the person is guilty. Now let us consider that my null hypothesis is true. That is, in this case, the person is not guilty. So in this case, ideally, I should not reject the null hypothesis. That is, I should simply accept the null hypothesis. But because of the wrong test results or wrong evidence, I rejected the null hypothesis. In this case, I will get the type 1 error. So what actually happened was the person was not guilty, but the court sentenced the person as guilty. So this type of error that we got is known as type 1 error. So a type 1 error means rejecting the null hypothesis when it is actually true. Now, in other case, let us consider that the null hypothesis was actually false. That is, the person was actually guilty. In this case, ideally, I should reject the null hypothesis. But suppose instead of rejecting the null hypothesis, I accepted the null hypothesis. In this case, I will be getting the type 2 error. So what happened was the person was actually guilty, but the code announced the person as not guilty. So this type of error is known as type 2 error. So a type 2 error means not rejecting the null hypothesis when it is actually false. I hope you understood the difference between the type 1 and type 2 error. So that was about hypothesis testing. If you liked the video, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe the channel. Thank you.